Good morning, Kairos. I hope you're all doing well today. Just to introduce myself, I'm Ethan. I'm one of the interns here at Kairos, and today I'm going to be talking to you about transforming relationships. Uh, Transforming relationships is a very broad topic. You can split this one topic into its own sermon series, I think, because there's a lot you can choose to delve into, like relationships between each other, relationships between the church and the world, between God and his people, between couples, between like parental relationships or friendships, etc. Like there's just a lot you can choose from. So today I'm just going to focus in on one thing in particular, and that is the relationship between Jesus and his 12 disciples, and what that means for us today. The 12 disciples were an interesting bunch. All of Jesus' followers were intriguing choices, to say the least. There was even a sermon I listened to a few years ago where I heard the 12 disciples were referred to as the 12 morons, and that might ring true some of the time. Jesus chose people that just would not have got along in the slightest. I'm understating it there, so I'll give you a bit of context to understand how much these people would not have got along. One of Jesus' disciples, Matthew, was a tax collector. As I'm sure many of you know, this was not exactly a popular profession, particularly amongst the Jewish people. Tax collectors were seen as traitors to the highest degree. Israel was occupied by Rome at the time, and there were some Jews that were willingly aided the occupying empire for their own gain, that being tax collectors. Not only did they steal and take more than they were told to, but they did this to their own people. And Matthew, one of Jesus' core 12 disciples, was one of them. Let's contrast Matthew with another of Jesus' 12 disciples, that being Simon the Zealot. Now, Simon is one of the more lesser known disciples in the 12, but what we do know is that the Zealots were a fanatical Jewish religious sect. Now, they were, let's use the word passionate. They believed passionately that the Romans were evil and that it was God's will they be removed from Israel and the land of the Jews by whatever means necessary, as in using violent methods and assassination attempts on Roman officials. They were freedom fighters, they were extremists, and they were zealous. It's in the name. Another one of Jesus' disciples, the one most famous for being the one that betrayed him, is Judas Iscariot. And he was also likely some sort of religious extremist, perhaps a zealot or even something more terrorist-like. There are a lot of possibilities for what the word Iscariot comes from, but one of the possibilities is the Greek word Iskari, which means dagger man. So it was really quite likely that Judas had killed people. Now, let's put them in the context of when Jesus called them to be his disciples. You had this willing traitor tax collector, Matthew, and these two religious extremist terrorists and possible murderers, Simon and Judas Iscariot, sat at the same dinner table and travelling around together and serving one another alongside each other for 3 years. To say that these men should have hated each other is an understatement. These men would not have just hated each other. These men should have tried to kill each other, given the context of their time. I've just thrown a lot of information at you, so let's just take a moment to breathe and just make sure you're keeping up. We good? Let's keep going. Here's the point on why I've just thrown all of that biblical context at you. In fact, I'm going to give away my main point now. These men, because they were in close proximity to Jesus, loved Jesus and served Jesus, had utterly transformed relationships with each other and with everything and everyone. Just simply being in close proximity to Jesus radically changed these men. And my word, must have been frustrating for Jesus. Like the sheer amount of bickering and spats and annoyances that these guys would have had, you would have had to have a godlike level of patience to be able to put up with them. The Sons of Thunder are a magnificent example of this. The Sons of Thunder were James and John, two brothers, also part of the 12. They were given this nickname because of their massive tempers, and when I say massive, I really do mean massive. Just look at Luke 9:46-48. An argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and made him stand beside him. Then he said to them, "Whoever welcomes this child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For it is the one that is least among you that who will be the greatest." Now, this is Jesus radically redefining what it meant to be in relationships with one another. However, if you look at just the very next part of this same chapter in Luke, in verse 54, the same chapter, James and John had a rather extreme reaction to people not welcoming them into their village. This is their reaction. "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy them?" Now, don't get me wrong here. I relate to James and John in this instance. There are just some days where you can be so fed up with everything, and calling down fire from heaven sounds like a pretty good option. But personally, I'm taking that as I've got some transforming left to do. But John's relationships were, however, radically changed and radically transformed. This is where John started, and the place in his life he was at when he encountered and first started traveling with Jesus. He was a hot-headed, quick-tempered, and honestly kind of violent man. But what he transforms into is amazing. Throughout his gospel, John begins to refer to himself as the beloved disciple. Now, this might almost seem arrogant at first, but then you realize that really it is an incredible transformation of character and how he relates to the world. From son of thunder to beloved disciple. There is an image that starkly contrasts with that image of him wanting to call down fire from heaven, and that's him at the Last Supper. John, or the beloved disciple, is described as leaning against the chest of Jesus. This man who wanted to burn up an entire village just because they didn't welcome him in, just wants to be close to Jesus. His transformation is even more evident later on in his life, when he is in prison on the island of Patmos. Although not included in the Bible itself, John is allegedly the only disciple who died of old age. According to legend, he was released from the prison he was being kept in his last days alive, and his friends from a church that he led in Ephesus came and collected him. They arrived, and he died upon the shore of Ephesus after giving his closest friends and colleagues one final 3-word sermon: love one another. Complete and utter transformation in his relationships to others. And this is all great. It's amazing even. But what does it mean for us today? Well, like I said, I already gave you away what my main point is. Close proximity to Jesus radically transforms our relationships. However, Jesus doesn't force us to be transformed through him and by being in close proximity to him. Just look at Judas. Jesus was one of the core 12. He was one of Jesus' closest friends and was completely and utterly loved by Jesus. But he was not transformed. He hardened his heart and deliberately turned away from Jesus and said, "No, I don't want to be transformed." Jesus doesn't make us be transformed. But when we finally come to the realization that, you know what, life with Jesus is the best thing to ever exist and I want it, and we let Jesus transform us, man, there's stuff that can change in people. He turns violent men into the most loving and soft-hearted. He turns murderers into missionaries. But Jesus transformed these people from where they were at, not from where he was going to get them. He accepted their mess. He embraced their humanness. Take Matthew, for instance. It was self-deprecating to Jesus' ministry to invite him, for him to invite Matthew to be a part of it. But he did it anyway. This is the transforming love of Jesus, embracing and accepting a person's mess, but loving them so much that he doesn't want them to stay there in that messy place. And through this, Matthew's relationships with everyone changed. He went from traitor and exploiter to missionary and gospel writer. This then is the takeaway, church. Leave space for mess. Never ever stop trying to be in close proximity to Jesus, because then you will see Kairos and the church's relationships with the world transformed and your relationships with others transformed, because you don't do the transforming. He does. Thank you very much for listening.
Everyone, the reading this morning is from Paul's letter to the Colossians. I'm reading from chapter 3, verses 12 to 17. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace, and be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly, as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. The saying goes, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. It's based on a quote from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. In the book, the point that's being made is that you don't turn your back on your kin, no matter what. Your blood relatives are too important for that. But the saying is more often used to make the point that you often get on better with your friends than you do with your family, because they are people, your friends, people you choose to be with, not ones that you've got saddled with by birth. When it comes to church then, are our relationships with one another based on friendship, or are we actually kin? We talk about being brothers and sisters in Christ. Our relationships with each other, just like those between the disciples that Ethan was talking about, are built around our common relationship with Jesus. In fact, when it comes to our church family, we really don't get to choose, no more than those disciples got to choose one another. But God does get to choose. Paul tells the Colossians that they are God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. Each one of us is chosen and dearly loved by God. Just pause there. Yeah, that means you, that means me, each of us, chosen and dearly loved. But of course, it's all the other people in church as well, even the ones that we might find a bit annoying. And let's face it, families can be annoying. But knowing that we're loved by God, that we're rooted in his family, and nothing can ever change that, gives us such a secure base and is the source of transformation for all our relationships. Because we don't have to compete for God's love. There's no need for any sibling rivalry in God's family. God doesn't want us to go around comparing ourselves with everyone else. Am I as spiritual as him? Are my gifts as worthy as hers? Do you ever find yourself doing that? It really isn't helpful, and it spoils our relationships. Earlier this year, we had a series taking a long look at the different aspects of love that Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 13. And here again in Colossians, Paul says very similar things. He says, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. All those qualities of Christian love. And as he says, clothe yourselves, we need to take as much care with those kind of clothes as the ones that we take out of the wardrobe every day. And when we gather to worship, when we're able to do that, or when we gather in our mission community groups, what would it be like for our relationships if we really thought about what we're wearing in terms of those qualities of Christian love? Praying that we'll act with kindness, grace, patience, humility towards one another. I know many of us are familiar with the Lectio 365 prayer resources, and at the end of the morning prayer, there's always this prayer, which I think is a great way to make sure that I'm wearing the right clothes. The prayer is, Father, help me to live this day to the full, being true to you in every way. Jesus, help me to give myself away to others, being kind to everyone I meet. Spirit, help me to love the lost, proclaiming Christ in all I do and say. All our relationships need working at, whatever they are, whether those are couple relationships, parent-child, brothers, sisters, friendships. They all need our investment. They need a conscious decision to love the other, to seek for the best for the other. And a key to that working is a willingness to forgive. Paul writes, bear with one another and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. It's so really sad when grudges and grievances are held on to tenaciously. People will just not let things drop. That's true in any relationship, but it's especially sad when it happens within the church family. Fallings out do happen. That's life. People do get upset. Sometimes they're about minor things, but other times they're about things that really do matter and really do need to be resolved. In my last church, it was a great source of sadness to me that there'd been a dispute over money and how that money had been spent in the past that really had never been resolved. And there were people holding on to grievances about that they just would not let go. And that caused division. And it spoilt and marred the relationships between that church family. So things like that can really destroy community, can destroy families, can destroy all relationships. And how can we claim God's forgiveness of us if we're just not prepared to forgive others, especially when it comes to our relationships within the church? Because Jesus prayed for unity amongst his followers. So how it must grieve the heart of God when his family gets broken by unforgiveness. So perhaps there are things that we need to be thinking about that need putting right now before they take hold and become too difficult to start to change. Not that we want to go around wearing our hearts on our sleeves all the time, but sometimes our minor irritations can grow and fester and become deeper and much more difficult to resolve. So if we are going to have relationships that are really truly transformed, relationships that will flourish, when there are things that need addressing, we need not to ignore them. And I wonder whether that's something we might reflect on a little in our mission communities, How well are our relationships? How healthy are they in those groups? Don't just assume that everybody's working well together. Maybe we need, as individuals, to talk to God about any issues that we might have personally. Talk to the leaders, maybe. And if there are tensions, work out how best can these be resolved. Paul's clear that being part of the body of Christ also involves admonishing one another with all wisdom. I think the emphasis should definitely be on the wisdom bit here, because it's not about going around telling everybody else off, correcting other people's faults, as much as being very honest about our own feelings. Sometimes we need someone to help us realise our own blind spots. Often the things that we get annoyed about in other people are the things that are our own personal faults as well. So we need to be careful. We need to check ourselves. Jesus obviously knew what he was talking about, didn't he, when he talked about taking the plank out of your own eye before you even look at the speck in someone else's. So to draw this to conclusion, at the end of our passage, Paul brings us back to the focus of our unity. And this is what Ethan was talking about, and it's fundamental to all our relationships, our relationship with Jesus. It's his teaching and our worship of him and our gratitude for all that he has done that is at the foundation of our faith and fundamental to all our relationships with Jesus and with each other. So he's the beginning and the end of all that we do and all that we are as God's holy people. And Jesus longs for his followers to live together in peace. He prays for them towards the end of his ministry on earth. He prays for us constantly to be one as the Father and he are one. Our faith and our relationships are built on that relationship with Jesus. So let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you are called to peace, and be thankful.